And so I started with an empty Go file and, func main and just started cranking away. This took like 4 or 5 months of just pacing around the room and talking through problems and like spike coding a bunch of stuff and just seeing what would work. It was a really busy time, but came up with, I think, a really awesome design, fairly novel architecture, and we were able to close over 400 issues and feature requests with just the new design alone.
Machines are so fast and stores are so big that they give us plenty of latitude to screw things up.
The shell, or which is the name we give to the command interpreter.
So the operator got a pair of tweezers and very carefully fished the moth out of the relay.
Because you all read the mythical Man Month.
And the best motivator in the world for programming is scratching your own itch.
Developers, 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 developers.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the SourceCraft podcast. I'm your host, Byung Liu, and today I'm chatting with Matt Holt, prolific Go open source contributor and creator of the very popular Caddy web server. Matt shares his initial motivations for creating Caddy, how the project grew and evolved over time, the journey from Caddy One to Caddy Two, and the challenges of maintaining a popular open source project. He also talks about his latest project, a developer-friendly TCP multiplexer called Project Conncept. Stay tuned. All right, I'm here with Matt Holt, creator of the popular Caddy HTTP server and contributor to many open source libraries in Go. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Beyond. Glad to be here.
Well, we have a lot to cover today, but as always, before we get into the kind of meat of your open source contributions, I wanted to start off by asking you, how you got into programming originally. What was that kind of initial spark for you?
I think it had something to do with growing up in Iowa, kind of in the countryside with no one else around to play with or anything. So I had to kind of do my own fun things, and part of that was tinkering on the computer, I guess, when I wasn't out working on the stable. So I think I credit it to learning. What did I learn? Visual Basic 6 and QBasic before that, tinkering around in MS-DOS 6. So yeah, those were fun days. Learning how to use like Windows 3.1 and see if I could cheat some of the games, and I don't know. Those were good times. That's what got me into it.
You got started early then with Windows 3.1.
Yeah, we had no internet, so I had to learn it all from books.
That's amazing. I actually didn't know that about you, that you grew up in Iowa. I actually grew up in Iowa too, although I think I had a far less productive childhood than you as far as computers go.
That's okay. You don't need a productive childhood. You need a fun one.
Yeah, absolutely. So in kind of like preparing for this conversation, I was trying to think back to like how I first met you. Like we met through the Go open source community, and I think it might have been one of the early GopherCons. Do you remember how we first met?
Oh man, good question. I don't. GopherCon sounds right. I think I went to the 2014 or 2015 GopherCons. So like the first couple of them.
Yeah.
So it very well could have been there. I think I met you and Quinn.
Yeah. That was time flies.
I know, so much has changed.
Yeah. So, given that you were at the early GopherCons, my sense is that you were a fairly early adopter of Go, tried it out in the fairly early days before too many people had adopted it. What kind of got you into the Go programming language in the first place?
The company I was working at was looking into using Go. This was about like right after 1.0 was tagged. So this was back in like 11-ish. And we were a C# shop. I was doing front end stuff at the time, but we were looking into Go for our new backend stack. And so I wrote one of the first services in Go. It was an address autocomplete API, which I think was running in production until like last year. It was like this awful Go code, my first Go project. But it was a breath of fresh air. I was coming from like PHP. I had done all backend in PHP before that, and man, Go was awesome. and I've been championing it ever since, and just grateful that Google hasn't abandoned it like every other one of their products. So hopefully that trend holds.
Yeah, I remember coming to Go from mostly Java, and I had very much the same reaction as you did. It was definitely a breath of fresh air.
Yeah, it's nice to be able to like have short lines of codes and not need your ultra wide monitor to read the class names. And I know that's like a trope, kind of a joke, but it's so true.
Yeah.
Actually,
totally. In
it's
fact,
funny because in college I wrote in my upper division classes, I would write my projects all in Go when you get to the point where you can choose your own language and everything, and and so I wrote all my stuff in Go, and my programs performed using the same algorithms basically like as my classmates. All my programs performed faster and used less memory. Like all my friends who were writing in Python had like they were really slow. All the friends who wrote code in Java, their like VMs would crash because like high memory usage and stuff. But it's again like comparable code base, like comparable algorithms. Just Go is just so much better. Like gave me a competitive advantage in school.
From talking to my brother who just graduated college, I don't think Go has actually been that widely adopted in the university environment yet. So if anyone is listening to this and they're currently in college, that's a pro tip for you. Write your assignments in Go, and
Yeah.
they'll automatically be faster and better than most of your peers.
Honestly, yeah, without the pain of C.
Yeah, totally. So the Caddy HTTP server, that's probably the project that you're most well known for. I think it's probably the most popular project that you've created. For those who are not familiar with it, how would you describe what it is and what it does?
Yeah, I would say just like you did, it's an HTTP server. So it's I guess you could compare it to Nginx or Apache or HA proxy and some other popular web servers and proxies. It is both a content origin, so like can serve up static files and render documents and things like that. But it's also a proxy, a very powerful and flexible HTTP reverse proxy.
And what is your kind of view of the landscape of HTTP servers and reverse proxies? You mentioned Apache and Nginx and HA proxy. What's kind of your analysis of that space, and where does Caddy fit in along with those others?
Yeah, so like when we released Caddy when it was a one-man project back when I first started it in 2015. When I released it then, there were the ones I named were the major players, and there's like IIS for Windows, and, but there was like 4 or 5 mainstream servers, a couple others like Lighty and stuff. But so it's a huge market. Like everyone needs a web server, and even these serverless architectures that came about later still use web servers. Fun fact. So everyone needs a web server, but there were only a few, and so I needed one that satisfied my requirements, and so I made one, and it was different from all the rest. And hopefully, if you use it, you kind of get a whiff of that, and you can get a sense of how it's different and hopefully better than what you're used to.
My sense is, I've used Nginx before and a little bit of Apache, but when I compare the experience of working with Caddy to those, it seems to me that kind of the developer experience was like at the top of your mind when you were building it, because it seems like fairly ergonomic, kind of a little bit more intuitive to me as like a developer who traditionally has not spent that much time as like a sysadmin or like operations focused person.
Yeah, I mean that was kind of the focus, right? Because I was setting up a bunch of random sites, especially for school and work projects, just a bunch of little sites and manually configuring them. And so I needed a server that could quickly just spin up a site with some semi-advanced functionality like proxying and or markdown rendering was a big one for me at the time. And templates like doing includes in my HTML files and stuff, little like things like that were like stupid but important for me at the time. And so it was just coming up with a way to configure it and just a little command to run it real quick. I don't think I had the future or like growth in mind when I designed it, and that really, if you followed the Caddy One life cycle, you can definitely feel like you could tell it got strained a bit. So things like server side includes, but better, a little more flexible, like including files into HTML files, but also like rendering like the current time or doing little transformations on subtext. So like stupid little features like that, but that were kind of hard to come by in other web servers. And so, and plus something that was easy to configure and just kind of made sense. So the Caddy file came about through that. And so anyway, I just built this server that satisfied my requirements and was just a lot easier to use at the time compared to any other servers that were out there.
Nice. And so you were building it for yourself at first. At what point did you say like, hey, this thing that I built for myself might be useful to others? And when did others actually start using it?
Yeah, so I developed it myself, and then had a classmate who I worked with. He kind of also gave me a little bit of a nudge back in the day, and then there were a couple other classmates actually that did contribute to it early on, like the fast CGI middleware to work with PHP sites. And so I was really grateful for their help. And then I realized when they started contributing to it and using it, maybe I should open source this thing. So I put it on GitHub, and then I put it on Hacker News, which was a mistake. Maybe not. I don't know. It was actually well received on Hacker News, but when it got to the front page there and got a lot of feedback, that was really helpful and embarrassing at the same time.
Yeah, the Hacker News crowd is can be very blunt and
oh boy.
Yeah, unforgiving at times.
Yeah.
But I mean, at the same time, now looking back, it's like, yeah, the project was clearly, filled a gap that others, felt that there was something that was needed there.
Yeah, I think so. And back in the day, it was HTTP2 and easy config. HTTP2 was cutting edge, and auto HTTPS wasn't a thing yet. Not quite yet. In fact, you couldn't even configure the TLS settings at all back, in the initial release.
What were kind of the big features that people found really attractive in those days? I think this was like circa 2013, or is that right?
No, it was 2015. Yeah.
Oh, 2015.
So
okay.
HTTP2 had just barely been standardized, or was close to being standardized. That was kind of the main selling point. It was like, hey, it was this cross-platform server. So it's a server that worked the same in Windows, Mac, Linux, FreeBSD, OpenBSD, whatever. It was an HTTP2 web server. So if you served, because HTTP2 is over TLS only, typically, if you enabled TLS at the time, you had to enable TLS. It would also serve HTTP2 just like that. It was really cool. And then I think people liked the easy configuration of the Caddy file. People liked it. They also hated it. I also was in both of those camps. I kind of liked it, but I hated it. Especially I hated it more as time goes on, and I hate it to this day. But it remains to this day, and we could talk about that later.
Yeah, and for those listeners who are less familiar with Caddy, it would behoove us to mention that there's Caddy One and Caddy Two. So we're talking about Caddy One right now, and we'll get to Caddy Two a little bit later.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm curious. What did you and others start to hate about Caddy One over time?
I definitely felt the pull of in many directions for features and capabilities. And to a certain point, it was cool. Like we were able to handle it. It came up with this like modular like plugin architecture. So you could just add an import and add new functionality to Caddy that way. And to this day, we still use that basic idea. These compile time plugins. So we can add more features infinitely and not bloat the code base. So that's really nice. But the way that Caddy loaded its configuration, received its configuration, and interacted with its environment, so like the use of signals and the lack of an API, like a REST API, was very limiting. So feature requests started to pile up, and did my best to keep the number of open issues under 100, but could only do that for so long. And, and I had to close or defer a lot of issues and be like, well, I mean, then Caddy isn't the right tool for the job, even though deep down I'm like,
Yeah.
that's stupid. It should work.
And at this point, were you still like the sole main contributor to the project, or had others joined?
Yeah, no, I mean, well, Caddy One had over 250, almost 300 contributors, people who made pull requests, maybe a line or two, change, but plenty of contributors. The problem is getting them to stick. And so, as far as maintainers go, we did have a few in our community who stuck around and developed features in a pretty dedicated sense. But it's been really hard to find maintainers who will to scale up the project in that sense, the maintainership of it, and to find people who will take some responsibility and also enjoy just like vetting the code and the I guess putting in it's a big ask to put in time on a project that's not yours, even if it's one that you use. I mean, people will contribute what they want or need, and then they'll leave and maybe continue using it, but they won't contribute it again. Yeah, it's been tough to find maintainers though.
Yeah, and I want to dive into the kind of the pain points of maintaining a large, wildly popular open source project at scale sustainably. But before we get into that, I think a lot of people out there would be they would be super glad to have that sort of problem, where there's like so many bug requests and feature requests because so many people are using it. So kind of to that end, do you remember what kind of the big inflection points were? Was there a point which like that things hit kind of like a hockey stick trajectory in terms of like more and more people were getting onto Caddy? Like what do you think were the factors in its kind of like explosive early growth?
That's a good question. So again, very initially it was the HTTP2, so the cutting edge technology and the configuration, the ease of configuration. And it kind of came to be known as like a local developer tool, or even a toy web server, something you would tinker with, but never something you would deploy into production, which is unfortunate because that was always the point of it.
Yeah, why did people perceive it as a non-production thing?
I don't know. Part of it, honestly, I think is psychological. Like I blame the name. I actually don't like the name Caddy, but it was the most descriptive name I could think of. That was because it kind of takes care of all these little details for you, so you don't have to worry about it as you play your game, so to speak, or as it just takes care of all that. And so, but the name is not as cool as like Nginx and Apache.
Sure.
It sounds dumb. So, but that honestly might be one reason. Another reason, and I hear this a lot. Oh, Caddy is so new. Well, Core DNS is even newer and is a Caddy plugin actually, and now is a Caddy fork.
Yeah.
But that powers Kubernetes, and Kubernetes is about the same age as Caddy. And I could name a bunch of other, Kong out there. I think launched around the same time. Like, I don't buy the whole "it's too new" thing. I don't know. I think people have just kind of made up their mind when you make a decision. It's probably no different than like meeting a person. You make a judgment, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean that's really too bad because it's a really good production web server. I mean we use it in production, and a lot of our customers do as well. So
cool. Yeah. And then back to your first question here. It also, I think another thing that did help though was the automatic HTTPS. I think that kind of wowed a lot of people. It still wows me today, actually, that works. The fact that you can turn on a web server with nothing more than a domain name to serve, and boom, it's over HTTPS in just a couple seconds. It has a certificate, it's managing it, it will keep it renewed. It staples the OCSP response for you. Like it does HTTPS right, and about as good as you can possibly do it out of the box. And no other server does that still to this day by default. Like there are plenty of services and servers that will like do it automatically, that will automate HTTPS, but you have to like check a box or turn it on with some config parameter. So anyway.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting because when I think about the pain points I encounter when standing up a web server, like setting up TLS and HTTPS is often extremely annoying. And so, why do you think it is that other web servers have just not prioritized that? Are we in kind of like a niche category here, or are they just not as like, focused on the developer experience, or
I,
what is it?
I don't know. It's hard, but maybe. I mean, maybe they're afraid of new major versions, but HA Proxy just
Hmm.
released a version 2.0 and it's still
Yeah,
not auto, it's still not HTTPS by default, but I don't know, honestly, like HTTPS just seems like the right default these days.
yeah. Do you have numbers around like how many people have downloaded and like are using Caddy today?
I did. Well, no, but yes. So, um, I mean, I have a rough idea of how many people have downloaded it from our website and how many people have cloned it from GitHub. And I have a rough idea of how many people or how many Docker polls there are. So that's the other thing
Hmm.
is tracking people versus deployments and downloads. Like it's all different and it's very nuanced. But Caddy has well over probably 40 or 50 million Docker polls if you consider all the different Docker images. We now have an official one that's a few months old. Thanks to community
Hmm.
contributions here, we've been able to make an official Docker image. Um, and then downloads from our website, 1.5 million over the last few years. Git clones, uh, hundreds of thousands. But again, that I don't know what that means as far as actual deployment scale that we're seeing. But
Yeah.
yeah, I tried finding out how widely Caddy is deployed with telemetry, which is also a good research tool because we were able to like learn about the technical landscape of the internet and see what kind of clients were out there on more than just proprietary networks like Cloudflare or
Oh, that's
Google
cool.
networks. Yeah,
Yeah.
but so we could see what kind of like TLS client hellos were being advertised and things like that.
Yeah.
But it was expensive to upkeep that, and people treated it toxically, unfortunately, and so I shut it
Yeah.
down. But
Yeah, telemetry is one of those really tricky issues, because there are a lot of people very passionate about data privacy and that sort of thing. And, I think, legitimately so in a lot of cases. But at the same time, I think a side of the conversation that often gets lost is, hey, the people who made this application want to, gather data so they can make it better for users and learn from it. And
yeah,
I feel like a lot of applications struggle with that sort of balance.
and yet people still use software like Linux and Firefox and Chrome and Windows, and all of which emit telemetry. So whatever.
Yeah. Let's talk about the journey from Caddy One to Caddy Two. So Caddy One was released in, I believe, it was April 2015, and then Caddy Two was just released earlier this year in May, right?
May the 4th. Yep.
May the fourth be with you.
It's with us all.
And so my understanding was Caddy Two was pretty much a rewrite from scratch. Although maybe there were a couple of components that you took over from Caddy One. But can you talk about that decision to make it kind of a major version upgrade and to revamp the code base?
Yeah. Well, like I had talked about it before, all these feature requests and issues started piling up, and so it was time to rewrite it. And so I started with an empty Go file and func main and
Hmm.
just started cranking away. First thing I had to figure out was, well, I became very familiar with all the open issues, um, and eventually came up with an architecture. This took like 4 or 5 months of just pacing around the room and talking through problems and like spike coding a bunch of stuff and just seeing what would work, doing a lot of research
Hmm.
as to what kind of like how would configuration be loaded, what would configuration look like, what format is it in, um, how can how can we achieve certain of these goals that we have in these open issues. There's a lot of
Hmm.
work. And I was just finishing grad school. I was right at the very end of my thesis. So it was a really busy time, but came up with, I think, a really awesome design, fairly novel architecture. Um, and we were able to close over 400 issues and feature requests. with just the
Wow.
new design alone. And I think we have the capability of closing all the remaining ones if people want to help put in some time and just finish them up.
That's awesome. What were kind of the key design and architectural decisions and insights that enabled all this?
Yeah, so the first one was how to load configuration and how to manage that. In V1, a major problem was that the Caddy file is just human readable and writable. So it was a bit restrictive if you wanted to automate your deployments, which is more and more popular these days. Everything should have an API so you can like programmatically interact with it. And so I designed it around a config API or an admin API. And then the other question was like, how do you what format? I have so many. There's actually a YouTube talk on this we could link to in the description maybe. But anyway, one of the main questions I had to answer was how do you change certain config parameters in real time, especially if you don't want to change the whole server. And if you do want to change the whole server, how do you do that efficiently? And how do you, like, you have the server with 1,000 concurrent clients actively using it. How do you change something? You can't just pull out the rug from all of them, can you? Well, turns out you can. And you can actually make it so that it feels like you're just changing one config parameter. Like, let's suppose that you have an API endpoint and you change just one config parameter using this endpoint. You can make it work like that, but still actually, if you swap out the whole config with just that one changed parameter, it's actually really efficient because it makes things really easy on the garbage collector to just clean up the one config value that it had provisioned. And then, so you actually can pull the rug out from under all your concurrent Go routines and put down a new one without anything noticing. It requires only a single lock, which is really nice. And so you can do dozens of config relets per second or whatever your hardware is capable of, no problem. And we also, this way, we don't need a lock around every single config parameter. You can imagine the concurrency nightmares that go along with that, which also introduces like two-way data binding problems. So anyway, there were a lot of these like config handling questions that had to answer. And I think we have a really good, simple solution for that works really well. We even have graceful reloads working in Windows, which is not something other web servers really offer, because the way we handle network sockets and do the graceful, like we gracefully transfer control of the socket from one server to the next. We do that in a way that works cross-platform, which is really kind of unique. So there was that issue. The new design also had to answer what the config looks like, and I'll cut to the chase and spare you the details as to why, but we settle with JSON. Whether you like it or not, the config is JSON. And it's actually a very elegant solution if you look into what you can do with it. And then writing JSON is obviously a pain, so the answer to that is to have config adapters, is what I call them, where these little pieces of code, they're Caddy plugins basically, that can change your config from any format you prefer into JSON. Because one of the reasons we had to pick JSON was because everything, almost anything, can evaluate down to a JSON document. Because of its, and there's a bunch of like language theory behind why that is, and declarative versus imperative syntax and all this stuff. But yeah, you can convert your Caddy file to JSON. So anytime you use a Caddy file in Caddy 2, it just converts it to the JSON under the hood for you. You can convert your Nginx config to Caddy JSON, and even run Caddy directly with your Nginx config like that. Toml and YAML obviously convert to JSON if you prefer those. And the thing is that with JSON config, we're able to expose just about every single config parameter of your web server in like a one-to-one format. So every field in a memory, like in a struct that's in memory, you can configure via JSON. So you have unprecedented amounts of control over your web server. So
That's awesome.
yeah, anyway, that's a really long answer, but that's also, I think, where Caddy 2 really shines. So I hope the power users will really appreciate that.
Cool. Another feature of Caddy 2 is kind of the extensibility part of it. And I understand that extensibility is achieved through these things called Caddy Apps. Can you explain what Caddy Apps are and what sort of things you can do with them?
Yeah. So Caddy Caddy is made of modules. A module is a piece of code or a plugin basically that adds something to Caddy's config structure. So if you look at the top level of a Caddy config of its JSON structure, it has like 4
Mhm.
fields. There's like logging and admin, and then there's storage, and then there's one called apps.
Mhm.
And the only thing Caddy knows how to do at its core, this is a crucial thing to understand about the Caddy architecture, is that it only knows how to load a config. It knows how to work with like those 4 fields, and that's about it. Everything else is handled by modules. So, for example, storage at that top level, you would configure various storage modules. It has a default storage module, of course, the file system.
Mhm.
But all it does is it says, oh, I'm supposed to use the file system storage, and then it loads that, and then the file system module or the storage module, whatever it is, will just run with that and do what it needs to do. And then when it gets to apps, it's just, hey, it's an app. And all it knows how to do is call start on the app, and it passes in a context. And that's
Hmm.
literally all Caddy does. And then when the config changes, it calls stop on the apps. Actually, I don't even think it does that. I think it just cancels the context, which implicitly calls stop on all the apps and calls
Hmm.
start on all the new apps. Um, so that's really all Caddy does, is it starts and stops apps. So apps are just pieces of Go code that implement an interface called caddy.app, which has 2 methods,
Hmm.
start and stop. And so the HTTP server is a Caddy app, which is a module that extends, its config structure. That when you start it, it loads all the servers that you have configured there, and it knows how to run them. And then when stop is called, it knows how to shut them down gracefully.
That's that's really cool.
Yeah, so apps can do anything that a long running program will do. So current apps that ship with Caddy standard are the HTTP service, the HTTP app, a TLS app, which manages certificates. So this means, by the way, that you can actually run Caddy 2 and manage certificates, meaning obtain them and keep them renewed over the lifetime of the process without needing to
Mhm.
run an HTTP server at all. You just say TLS, and then there's like a couple other properties, but you just specify the names, the domain names that you need certificates for, and it will just keep them renewed in your storage, which is a file system by default, but it could also be a database or literally anything. So, I mean, it's
Yeah.
super flexible here. Like, we're talking unprecedented and unlimited amounts of extensibility, basically, as long as it's written in Go. So,
And why is there that requirement of it being written in Go?
yeah, because these are compile time dependencies. So Caddy always is a static binary. Well, it's a static binary. So you can ship around this executable that cross compiles to basically any platform, and
Mhm.
it will just work. You have no external dependencies, not even libc. Now, granted, we don't really have control over third-party apps and modules as to what they do. Like, they might use Cgo, and that's up to them. We
Yeah.
discourage that typically, and I don't think we'll officially distribute any that have external dependencies like that.
Mhm.
But yeah, so the idea is that if you want to extend Caddy, you do it at compile time, and then you can ship around these static binaries. You don't have to worry about like which Python version you have installed or which C libraries you've got and all that stuff on a system. Frankly, you don't need Docker to run Caddy. Like, people do because
Yeah.
that they're already ingrained in that ecosystem, but it's just a
Yeah.
static binary. Just run it.
Yeah, that's one of the magical things about Go is that you can cross compile it to basically any computing platform, and it's just that single executable. You drop it in, and it just magically works.
Yeah, it's so nice.
So Go has kind of a plugin package in its standard library, but you went the route of actually statically compiling Caddy apps into the code as opposed to using the kind of
Yeah.
plugin mechanism in the Go language. Can you talk about why you went that route?
Sure. Yeah. The Go plugin package is interesting, but it's an experiment, and it's not great. I mean, it's not Go's fault. It's just that's just how it is.
Yeah.
It's a hard problem to do dynamically linked runtime dependencies, and also makes things difficult and tricky. And frankly, there's not a huge win, in my opinion. I know that people like that way of doing things, and like I respect that, but it's just a lot more reliable and a lot less stressful to um, just get a static binary that has everything you need and then just ship that. Now, this is difficult when you're talking about like certain distribution platforms and packaging systems that, for example, packaging a Go program for like Ubuntu, like an official Ubuntu or Debian package is a nightmare. I don't even know if it's possible because of you have to package every dependency all the way down to the metal, basically. And that's really hard in practice. So, anyways, Go plugins are fine, but they're not like something that we wanted to rely on. So the Caddy way of doing it is you just add an import to your main function, and literally as long as it's just compiled in, the plugin will register itself on init when the program is starting up, and then Caddy can use it. And we have tools to help manage that pretty easily. So
that makes sense. So going back to Caddy apps and what you can do with them, I want to dive into like some of the other things that you and perhaps members of the community have built through Caddy apps. And perhaps I'll start with kind of a personal anecdote, which is, SourceGraph. We support SSO because it's often a requirement for the companies that we sell into, large enterprises, things like that. And I was actually the one who wrote a lot of our original SSO code. I remember at the time looking into like Nginx plugins for SSO, but getting kind of lost in the documentation. And there's always that worry in the back of your mind where like maybe it works for the first one or two cases, but eventually you're going to hit some edge case where the plugin doesn't support what you need it to do, and so then you're left kind of hitting a brick wall. And so that's why we ended up just building SSO into the SourceGraph application itself. But if I were writing that today, knowing what I know about Caddy and Caddy apps and the plugin architecture, it seems like a much better path would have been to like write SSO support as a Caddy app, and then because it's just Go code, I could just make it talk to whatever backend or database I needed it to connect to for user validation and things like that. Is that that's kind of the idea?
Exactly, a great use case. Yeah. So there's a couple ways you could do it, right? Like SSO is it's a hard problem, but it could be a Caddy app if it's standalone, like if it can run on its own, you just call start and then it does its thing. Or if you need it to be like an HTTP handler, it could be an HTTP handler module, and you can plug that in instead. I know that a developer named Paul, he's been working on some authentication modules for Caddy Two, and he's done some really cool stuff. They're very powerful. They're still kind of in the early days, but he wants people to help test them. But so Caddy, it would be a great use case for things like authentication, anything that again is long running. Another benefit too of writing a Caddy module instead of a separate piece of code that you have to ship and run and manage. Well, so that's a nice thing, right? Is you can, if your whole stack is written in Go and they're all Caddy modules, then that means you ship one binary around and you have all your services in that one central configuration that you manage, and they all automatically benefit from this real-time online config API, because the config API just manipulates the JSON struct in real time while the server is running. And since it's all one JSON structure, You can just
Mhm.
manipulate it, and we also can automatically document it. So if you go to our Caddy website and you look at the documentation and you look at the JSON config structure, there's all this automatically generated JSON documentation, which normally is not that difficult to do, except that because of its extensible nature, like
Yeah.
it's, like we have the top level, and then we have a few keys or properties, and then we have the apps key, and then what's within that? Well, it's impossible to know until we have like modules, but this system, this documentation system, you can just hover over it and see what modules are available there. You click on the one you want to use, um, and so there, it's all self-documenting automatically.
That's awesome. I think documentation is such an important part of developer experience and ergonomics, and I think Caddy does a fantastic job of that. Like the docs are so user friendly and easy to explore.
I'm glad you said that. Can we feature that on the podcast page? Because I don't hear that too
Absolutely.
often. But I mean, our docs could improve, but like they're pretty good. We get a lot of complaints, but they're not actually that bad.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like however much effort you invest into your docs, there's always going to be a long tail of people that will say like, well, I had a hard time using them, and
yeah, I mean, we can work on that, but they're not bad. Anyway,
at least from this user's perspective, I've had
okay.
a overall very positive experience with the docs.
Awesome.
And so I actually wanted to ask you, like is what is the key to having good docs? Are there a couple things that you found that really work for you and your community?
The documentation is hard. I think it's important to scope your documentation and keep it, frankly, pretty narrow. Like it's not your job. For example, we're a web server. Technically,
Mm-hmm.
we're an application platform, but most people use it as a web server.
Mm-hmm.
Our job is not to explain how the internet works. It's not our job to explain how to configure. Frankly, like I know it's funny when you say it like this, and I don't mean to come off.
I know exactly what you're talking about, though.
I don't mean to come off condescending, but like frankly, it is not the documentation's job to explain how to open like that ports 80 and 443 need to be used for HTTP and HTTPS typically.
Yeah.
Or how to like configure your firewalls and other network things, like, or how to run a process on Linux, and after a reboot, like I mean, we have official like packages and we have a tutorial, but it really, our docs need to be focused on how to use the software. And so we get a lot of complaints that like our docs don't tell you enough, but the reason is because we kind of expect you to, frankly, to know how to use your computer and how the internet works. And when you're ready to come learn how to use a web server, like Caddy is not a child's toy. It's an advanced tool. I think that was our biggest mistake in V1, was touting it as like it's easy to use. That was a mistake, because web servers, no matter how easy you make them to use, like, and Caddy is not hard to use, but there's a lot going on and you just need to understand it. And so read the documentation. We have tutorials that like users should go through. I want everyone, no matter how experienced or expert you are, to go through the Getting Started guide. Just go through Getting Started. Go through either the API tutorial or the Caddy file tutorial, whatever you want. Go through at least those two things, and then the rest of it is reference documentation mostly. You can just, once you know what you are looking for, just find it in the reference documentation and then kind of figure it out. Like, and we'll improve it where there's mistakes or gaps, but yeah, like focus the docs. You need to separate tutorials from reference, and then also kind of expect something of your users. It's okay to do that.
Yeah, definitely. I've certainly, had the experience of, even with something like SourceGraph, which isn't even an HTTP server, but like, sometimes I'll get random emails from people saying like, hey, could you help me answer this like homework question? I'm like, this has nothing to do with SourceGraph, but I almost like, I feel like, for a lot of people, maybe it comes from a good place. Cause when I think back to when I was, very new to development, you can very easily get overwhelmed by just like the sheer quantity of stuff that you may or may not have to comprehend about how the internet works, how computer works. But
Yeah.
I guess my advice to anyone who's submitting like a question or that sort of thing to like a open source project is just be upfront with your level of knowledge. Like if you're kind of like grasping at straws, just like say that. And like oftentimes people are very happy to like point you in like the right direction, but just like
Yeah.
err on the side of saying like hey, I'm a noob here, I'm trying to get this up and running. I understand this may not be the best forum, would love any pointers that people might be able to give. I think that sort of ask will have a much higher likelihood of getting a useful response.
Definitely, definitely. And it's hard because like we developers, maintainers have limited time, and I want to help people. I would love to tutor people and help people on like their homework project problems, but I have limited time to do that. And yeah, like also I would suggest don't go in guns blazing blaming the software. Like yes, I know that even you may know what you're doing and how to use your computer, but it might not actually be the software's fault. And honestly, I would say more than 50%, close to three quarters, I don't know, I'm spitballing here, but a lot
Mm-hmm.
of the forum threads and issues that are opened with the Caddy project at least are not actually issues with Caddy. They're usually issues with like a Cloudflare configuration or like a network misconfiguration or a
Yeah.
Docker mess up. Docker, so many times Docker. Or DNS. Docker and DNS are like equally problematic. And then, and actually the problem has nothing to do with Caddy. Like most of the time, Caddy works, the software
Yeah.
works. Like it's just putting all the pieces together is hard, and I get that, but just don't come in blaming the software. Like just be open to possibilities and help us understand your entire setup. And yes, it's a lot of information to write down, and it takes time to boil it down to its simplest form and make the problem reproducible so we can experience the same thing. And these are all skills that we want the community to learn, but they're very helpful and very important. um, and then but yeah, like when we do get good reports, we can fix the bugs. So
Yeah, absolutely. So, beyond Caddy, you've created and contributed to quite a few other like very, very popular packages in Go. Just to name a few, there's JSON to Go, Pop-up Parse, Archiver, Timeliner, Curl to Go, Checkup. Like people should really go to your GitHub page and check out all the amazing stuff that you've done. But I understand that you're kind of working on a new project now that's something to do with like layer 4 TCP multiplexing.
yeah, that's my latest side project that I'm having fun with. It's a Caddy app that, um, if you're familiar with Caddy's HTTP server, it's a similar idea. Or it's
Mhm.
basically, yeah, it's a TCP, UDP, proxy, and server. So instead of operating at the HTTP or the application layer, it operates at the transport layer. So it accepts raw network connections or packets, and then you can configure Caddy to do whatever you want with it. Everything from, you can first match on the connection. So similar to the HTTP server where you have this powerful idea of matchers, which are
Yeah.
pieces of configuration that select or filter certain requests, right? You can match on HTTP headers or the path of the request or the client IP or the time of day or whatever else. Like it's
Yeah.
just a filter basically. You can do this at the layer 4 now. You can match
Hmm.
on the client IP, of course, or does the connection look like an HTTP protocol? So it can read in a few of the bytes and like sniff it out, and then does it look like a TLS handshake? Does it look like SSH? Does it look like some other database protocol or whatever? And then you can match on connection type and multiplex various different protocols and connections on a single socket. So that's really cool. And then you can from there, you can proxy it with like load balancing and health checks, or you can echo it back if you're like debugging or whatever, troubleshooting. You can tee it off, kind of like the Linux T command. That's kind of useful
Yeah.
sometimes. You want to record what's coming in from a client, but also still pass it upstream.
Mhm.
you can terminate TLS or you can not terminate it, whatever you want to do. And then, of course, TLS termination, you get the benefits of certificate management for free, the automatic TLS. So anyway, it's a really cool, really flexible piece of software that I'm really excited about.
Would it be safe to call it like Caddy, but for layer 4 instead of layer 7? I hate to do the X for Y thing, but is that kind of like a...
Yeah, it's basically the same thing. And I call it Project Conncept with 2 N's, like a connection.
That's cool. That's cool. That's a cool name.
Yeah, it's better than Caddy. So yeah, it's Apache license. It's not open to the public while I'm developing it. I'm right now sponsors get exclusive access. So if you sponsor me, you can get early access, and you can test it out. And I'd love your feedback. Whoever's listening to this that would like to try it. Cool. Hopefully, I have the sponsor goal. If you go to my sponsor page, and once you reach that goal,
this is for GitHub sponsors, right?
Yep. GitHub.com/sponsors/mholt HOLT. You'll see that I have a sponsor goal, and once you reach that goal, then I'll open it to the public, and we can get to that goal faster at higher tier sponsorships too. So, like if you want to advocate for your company to sponsor, that would be like an ideal arrangement, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I would highly encourage anyone who is, remotely interested in this sort of thing to go and sponsor that project. It seems extremely useful, extremely cool.
It's a fun one.
I think, yeah, and also I think like open source contributors, maintainers, like they invest so much time and effort into making these libraries and tools that we all can use. That
yeah.
But they also have to pay the bills at the end of the day. So
we do, yeah. I recently put out a tweet comparing open source sponsorships to like athletic sponsorships. You know how like athletes will be sponsored. Typically, athletes are sponsored by like one company, or like I don't know, NASCARs are sponsored by like a couple or few companies maybe. But like open source developers are sponsored by 1,000. Well, the really popular projects, and Caddy is actually not at this scale, but like you look at projects like Vue or whatever, and they have like thousands of sponsors, and they're each doing like $1 or $5 a month. And I just thought it'd be so funny if like athletes were sponsored by like thousands of their fans at $1 a month or something. Like,
yeah.
Kind of weird. That's a weird thought. The corporate sponsorship really is the way to go, I think.
Yeah. So I just went on and sponsored you, and I encourage everyone else to do the same. So I guess, yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I feel like this is the least I could do.
Oh, this is fun.
As kind of like a final thought, you've built like a fantastic reputation as one of the most active open source contributors in the world of kind of modern web utilities in the Go open source community. Looking back on your journey, do you have any lessons or words of advice for people who aspire to be like you, Matt?
Don't.
Oh no.
No, I mean, I just would not go into. I would not go into open source development thinking that you're going to make a living off of it. I've been very fortunate and have pushed really hard to make that happen. And I'm not going to try and discourage, like, if you want to do that, go for it. Like, I think that's a great goal, but I think it's better if like companies who are already profitable and developers who work for companies who are, who already have a salary, getting into open source at that point, I think that's good. I think it's healthy for tech companies to be involved in open source, but I would just honestly, like, I wouldn't over glorify open source development.
Yeah,
it definitely is not perfect and has a lot of issues, but if you like working with communities, and if you like, so like I'm still personally developing better like patience and kindness toward everyone. So like that's something I'm working on. And if you're really into that, then community sense of things, then open source is really great. But it doesn't need to be a goal. You can still be a really successful developer doing a normal day-to-day development job that may not get any recognition, unfortunately, but just please do your job well, whatever it may be, because we who are using your company's products are relying on that,
Yeah,
so
definitely. And I really do hope that someone comes along and cracks the very tricky nut of how do we enable open source contributors and authors to make a sustainable living off their work, because I think whoever does that will do a huge favor to the world.
Yeah, I agree. I could give you a formula that I think will work
Yeah.
You have to tailor it to each circumstance, but and this is not my own formula, but I've seen this work, and that is find companies who will sponsor your projects, or sponsor you personally as the maintainer, where your project or your work benefits the company, either their employees or their customers, because either of those audiences are profitable for the company. So if you write a developer tool that the company's employees use, then it's in the company's best interest to sponsor your development and keep that project alive. And not even necessarily in direct exchange for your service, but although you could, if you wanted to make it a consulting sale in that sense, you could. But just the fact that the project is going to keep going and has some security behind it is a very valuable thing. It's also a super good look for the company.
Yeah.
Imagine this company, that sponsors this little open source project that is actually really important to them and their customers. And they're able to say, hey, send out an email to all their customers or put on their website like, hey, we sponsor this project, because you use it and you benefit from it, and we want it to stay alive and healthy and well. We're pleased to be behind our customers who use this. That's a really good look, and so this can work really well. I'm fortunate in that right now my living is covered basically by sponsorships, a single corporate sponsor, and then I have many individual sponsors. So I really rely on that to continue working on Caddy full time.
That's awesome. As kind of like a final question, if people listening, they want to try out Caddy or Project Conncept or any of your other work in the Go community, what would you recommend they do?
Just go to the Caddy website and you can click download and just get a build for your system, or you could do any of the packages we have, Docker included, and then just go to the Getting Started guide and just go through the tutorial, and then find the next tutorial, whether it's a Caddy file or API tutorial, and just start playing with it and see how useful it can be for you. And then feel free to post on our forums, get involved, and even if you don't need help with anything, go find someone who is asking. We have a lot of people asking questions about how to get Caddy to work with their setups, and again, most of the questions aren't really so much like problems in Caddy. It's just they just don't know how to get their setup to work, and so we could really use more people helping on our forums. We have a few wonderful contributors to our forums who are very active and helpful, but it'd be nice if they weren't, that burden wasn't only on just them.
My guest today has been Matt Holt. Matt, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much, Byung. This has been fun.
The SourceGraph podcast is a production of SourceGraph, the universal code search engine, which gives you fast and expressive search over the world of code you care about. SourceGraph also provides code navigation abilities like jump to def and references in code review, and integrates seamlessly with your code host, whether you're working in open source or on a big, hairy enterprise code base. To learn more, visit sourcegraph.com. See you next time.